And Jesus says, and here Paul says, all of that happened at the cross. Every bit of that happened when we saw what kind of a being God really is. I'm talking not in terms of his nature, because none of us know what God is by nature. I'm talking in terms of his essential character, the kind of person that he is. And we saw that as contrast with the kind of person that Satan is. When those two were put together, we said, hey, the Bible writer said, hey, he's defeated. He's been humiliated. So notice the centrality of the cross in ushering in Satan's defeat and what we call the last day. So this is, from a biblical perspective, since Satan lost, or the enemy lost, sin and death, these are the last days. Satan himself knows it, as we just read there in Revelation chapter 12. He knows that his time is short. Okay, so here we are, living in the last days. Now, having said that, let me give you a second reason. The prophetic timelines are mostly fulfilled. And what I'm going to have to do here is just give you an overview. If you're familiar with the prophecies of Daniel, this will just be a brief review. If you're not, you're going to think, man, there's a lot there I want to dig into. First of all, we've mentioned already a number of biblical prophecies, things like Israel's failures, the promised judgment to Assyria, Babylon, etc., captivity, the prophecies of Daniel, all of those messianic prophecies that we've spoken of, and the end-time prophecies of Revelation that we'll pick up tomorrow and in the future. Here's the major prophecies of Daniel we've already mentioned. The metal man, the four beasts of chapter 7, the horn in the sanctuary of chapter 8, the covenant-keeping Messiah, which is the only one we've gone into in depth here of chapter 9, and then chapters 10 to 12. Here's the basic outline of the prophecies of Daniel, okay? So this is very simple for those of you that are familiar with this. This will be very simple for those of you that aren't. Go back to the time of Daniel, which is some 600 years before the time of Jesus, in and around the time of Babylon. Babylon, as we've already mentioned, under King Nebuchadnezzar, was the nation that destroyed Jerusalem and ruined the temple, okay? Or I should say destroyed the temple and leveled Jerusalem, okay? Then Daniel and his compatriots were led back to Babylon, and thousands and hundreds of thousands of Jews lost their lives. So the prophecies of Daniel, these apocalyptic prophecies, begin in the time of Babylon, and they move through this basic sequence. From Babylon to the passing of the torch to the next major power, Medo-Persia, to the next power, which was Greece, to Rome, which was the power, of course, that was in play in the New Testament when Jesus was nailed to a Roman cross and was watched by Roman soldiers, etc. Then Rome would be divided, and this mysterious little horn figure would come on the scene. That's what the New Testament refers to as the Antichrist, followed by divine intervention. Okay? So this is the basic way that the prophecies of Daniel work. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Medo-Persia, Greece, Greece, Rome, the division of Rome, the emergence of this crazy satanic power called the little horn, and then finally followed by a divine intervention. So, one of those prophecies, we'll look at just 3 of them in brief tonight, is the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2, where King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And in that dream, he sees a man, a metal man. It has a head made of gold, chest and arms made of silver, belly made of bronze, legs made of iron, feet of iron and clay. Daniel then sees that a stone, as you can see signified there by that fiery meteor-looking thing, comes and strikes the image on the feet. This is key. It doesn't strike the image on the chest. It doesn't strike the image on the belly. It doesn't strike the image on the head. So, when we then look at the interpretation of Daniel 2, within the intertextual evidence of Daniel 2 itself, not added by Pastor David or anybody else, the intertextual evidence of Daniel 2 itself, in fact, the whole of Daniel says that head of gold was Babylon, the chest and arms of silver were Medo-Persia, the belly and thighs of bronze were Greece, followed by the long legs of iron, then of Rome, then that long legs of iron were divided into feet of iron and clay, and then the stone comes and God sets up his own kingdom. That's Daniel 2. That's the basic template. Now, first of all, you'll notice several things here. The first thing I want you to notice is that this goes well before the time of Jesus. So just let's get a timeline here. Maybe we can just sort of graph this. So we'll say that this stool here represents the time of Jesus. In fact, we'll just say it represents the cross. Okay? So here's the cross event. And then this back here is before the time. So this is, say, Babylon. So Jesus lived well after Babylon. Babylon, sort of AD 6 or BC 600. And then we go from Babylon to the Persians, the Medes and the Persians, from the Persians to the Greeks, from the Greeks to Rome, and now this is key, watch this. Jesus lives during the time of Rome, around the time of the first century, right? We have tons of evidence of this, of course. So the New Testament's written against the backdrop of Rome, okay? So Jesus is looking backward at Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, Rome. And then the prophecies of Daniel look forward, at least here in Daniel chapter 2 and 7, and we'll see others, look forward to the final dissolution of Rome, the emergence of this little horn power, and then the divine intervention that follows. Now, so Jesus is living, as it were, kind of in the middle of this. Not exactly chronologically, because there was 600 years before and there's been now 2,000 years after. But here's the larger point. Already you're alerted to something. Surely this ought to raise your suspicions that this prophecy is either a giant hoax or it's accurate. But I'm going to try and give you a really good reason to believe that it can't be a giant hoax. And here's why. First of all, we've already talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1946 and 1947. And portions of every book except for one of the Old Testament were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the book of Daniel. Okay, so now let's just put our thinking caps on here and orient ourselves to the time. Jesus is living first century, right? Jesus himself said, when you see these certain things happen, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then don't, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, don't come back in, flee to the mountains. You follow that? Okay, so here's Jesus living here at this time. He's looking back to Daniel and saying that something future will happen based on the prophecies of Daniel. You understand that? So Jesus believed in the basic historicity of Daniel, number one, and number two, he believed in the prophetic nature of Daniel. So have I lost anybody so far? This makes sense, right? Now here's where things get really interesting. Because the prophecies of Daniel are so, frankly, seemingly accurate, one of the major critiques of the book of Daniel from liberal scholars has been that the book of Daniel must have been written much later than the traditionally agreed upon date, which is, several hundred years before the time of Jesus, between 500 and 600 years before the time of Jesus. So some say, well, it must have been written sometime during the Greek period, maybe or even in the early Roman period. Okay, let's just grant that for a moment here. Let's just say that it was written much later than we traditionally think of it as having been written. Here's the problem. Rome, the dissolution of Rome, which you see up there, 1, 2, 3, 4, the legs of iron, Rome does not dissolve finally, the Western Roman Empire, until AD 476. Okay, so let's just do the math here. Jesus lives at the turn of the century. So we're talking about the anticipation and the prophecy of something that will happen almost 5 centuries yet future. And this is exactly what happened with Rome. Rome wasn't conquered, of course, by an even bigger power than Rome. Rome was divided. And it was divided, fascinatingly, according to what the text says here in Daniel 2, into the feet of iron and clay. Nations that were partly strong and nations that were partly weak. But ultimately, if you have a big top-heavy statue, gold is, of course, very heavy, silver heavy, bronze not as heavy, legs of iron very heavy, and it's all resting on dirt and clay. It's a top-heavy situation. So what it's saying is that history will become increasingly unstable. That's basically the world that we're living in now. We're living in a world where things are getting less and less stable. And man, I could spend a lot of time on this. But after the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, things have become hugely less stable. In fact, let's just use a case in point. When I was growing up, the map of Europe looked much different than it does today. I'm only 43. Right? There used to be Yugoslavia. Now there's 6 nations in the former Yugoslavia. Divisions, and not just divisions, but tensions as a result of those divisions. The world history right now, whether it's the East and the West, or Christianity and Islam, or secularism and whatever, it's massively unstable. I think that would be a fair statement for us to agree upon. So this is the basic picture that's being presented here by Daniel 2, of a figure that's tottering down toward the end. Now here's the key. Whenever you believe Daniel was written, I happen to believe in the traditional authorship of the book of Daniel, so about 500 to 600 years before the time of Jesus. There's lots of good reasons to believe this. I don't have time to go into them now. But even if you believe it was written 150 years before the time of Jesus, let's just say you took the liberal view. Okay, fine. You still have these prophetic elements that are hundreds of years out from Jesus. You follow the point? So no matter how you slice this thing, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, smells like a duck, looks like a duck, it's a duck, okay? It's a prophecy. No matter how you slice this, Jesus spoke in the first century about the past looking to the book of Daniel and anticipating that things would happen yet future based on this book. Okay, now having said that, the next prophecy of Daniel is of these beasts. From a tottering metal statue, it goes to these beasts, and there are 4 of them. The first was like a lion with eagle's wings. The second was like a bear with 3 ribs in the mouth. The third was a 4-headed leopard with wings, and then a strange and unusual beast with 10 horns. Now check this out. It follows the very same pattern. From Babylon, which is the lion, to the Medo-Persia, which is the bear with the 3 ribs, to Greece, which is the leopard with the 4 heads, and there's a fascinating little detail there I'll give you just briefly. This is one of the things that causes liberal scholars to think that the book of Daniel must have been written after the events that it describes, because after Alexander the Great's untimely and early death, at the age of approximately 30, there was nobody strong enough or charismatic enough or influential enough to step into the giant shoes left vacant by Alexander the Great's premature demise. So what did they do? Alexander's empire was divided into 4, to the north, the south, the east, and the west. Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysander, and Seleucus. I forgot the other one. Anyway, look it up. So the fascinating point here is that the leopard in the prophecy is depicted as having 4 heads. It's just like people say, oh, surely written after the events that it describes. Okay, let's just say you grant that. Somebody says, oh, somebody wanted to play a joke and write this prophecy as if it had been written before, but after the actual demise of Alexander. Okay, fine. But what do you do with the dissolution of Rome, which takes place 500 years yet future? Okay, it gets tricky. Okay, then you go to Rome, which is the beast with the 10 horns. The 10 horns on this beast corresponding to the 10 toes of the image of the metal man. Then you have this little horn, which is none other than the medieval church, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. I'm going to give you 5 good reasons to be nervous about the church. One of the great mysteries of Bible prophecy is that the church itself emerges as an anti-Christian figure. I'll say that again. One of the great mysteries of Bible prophecy is that the church itself emerges as one of the chief anti-Christian figures. And then finally, there's a judgment scene. Okay, so now, just so you know that this isn't something that I just made up, these are pictures that were taken by a friend of mine at the courthouse in Nuremberg. Okay? So what you have here is the entrance, there's a front and a back entrance to the courthouse in Nuremberg, Germany. And what you see on the left, and I'll show you up close in just a moment, on the right, these are 2 figures. On the left, you're going to see a man that looks like a Nebuchadnezzar-type figure, a Babylonian-type figure, with a lion and eagle's wings. On the right, you'll see a Persian warrior holding a Persian scepter and a bear that has 3 ribs in the mouth. This is on the back. On the back, you see on the far left, or on the left, not the far left, but the left is a Greek soldier, perhaps Alexander himself, and a 4-headed leopard-like creature that's behind him. And then on the right, you see a Roman soldier and a strange, unusual, Daniel doesn't ever tell us exactly what kind of beast it is. He just says it's a terrifying beast, and it has 10 horns coming out of it. Okay, so here's slightly up close. So here's this Babylonian figure, and you can see clearly behind it, to our left, is a lion with eagle's wings. Right? Do you see that? It's just plain as can be. Over on the other side, here's a Persian warrior holding a scepter, and there's a bear, and it's not easy to see here, but I could show it to you on my computer. It has 3 ribs coming out of its mouth. This is clearly the image of Daniel chapter 7. Now we go to the back. Here's the Greek figure, the Alexander the Great type figure, and right behind him, what else? A 4-headed leopard. And then finally here, this Roman soldier, some ferocious beast. It looks like a cross between a bear and a dog, and it looks like it has a pineapple coming out of its head. Do you see that? Okay, that's 10 horns. And if you look, it's actually fairly difficult to see, but in the middle of one of the horns is something that looks like an acorn. Do you see that? But here's the remarkable thing. That acorn is actually a human head. And it's this little horn that's spoken of in Daniel chapter 7. Okay? So here's the point. This is not something that David just made up and said, hey, look, that represents Babylon, that represents Medo-Persia, that represents Greece, and that represents Rome. I'm not exactly sure when the courthouse in Nuremberg was built, but I think it was built in the 1600s. So this is a well-established understanding of the basic trajectory of the prophecies of, oh, you want to hit play on there? I hit the wrong button. Of Daniel. Just hit the little play button there. Perfect. Thanks, Richard. Okay. Now, Daniel chapter 8, I'll just breeze over. It's the same basic trajectory. Now we transition from Babylon has passed off the scene, and it starts off with a ram with 2 horns, Medo-Persia, followed by a goat with a large horn. Now, this is very interesting. I'll tell you a fascinating story that Josephus records. Josephus records that when Alexander the Great actually came through Palestine, that a group of Jewish priests went out and met him. Now, check this out. And showed him these prophecies. Showed him the prophecies of Daniel and said, we believe that you are this king. We believe that you are this great king that's spoken of here, the goat that had this giant horn, and therefore we believe that you will certainly be successful in this battle. And he was. So these prophecies were literally showed to young, ambitious, militarily brilliant Alexander the Great and said, this is you. This is talking about you. Can you imagine? Epic. Okay. Then we have this little horn that comes up. That's the little acorn-looking thing that was on the head of the pineapple. Moving on the horizontal plane, which is Rome. Moving on the vertical plane, which we'll talk about tomorrow, which is the medieval church. And then finally, divine intervention with the cleansing of the sanctuary. So here's what you have. All of that is by way of setting up this chart. So what you have across the top is, first of all, history as it actually unfolded. And then the 3 of the major prophecies of Daniel. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8. Okay? Then you have the symbols that are represented by each of them. So, for example, in Daniel 2, this is the metal man. Gold is Babylon. Silver, Medo-Persia. Bronze is Greece. Rome is the iron. Then you have the division of Rome, which causes the little horn to emerge, the medieval church, and then divine intervention, which is the stone. Then you go to Daniel chapter 7, and you see a lion, which is Babylon. You see the bear, which is Medo-Persia. You see the leopard, which is Greece. Rome, which is the beast, followed by the 10 horns, which correspond to the 10 toes, which we've already mentioned, and then divine intervention in the form of judgment. And then in Daniel chapter 8, by this time Babylon has already passed off the scene. Daniel's an old man. It begins with the ram of Medo-Persia, which are actually named, literally named, the Medes and the Persians in the book of Daniel. Greece is named in the book of Daniel. This is another one of the reasons that people think, oh, it must have been written well after the events that it describes. Then you have the horn, little horn moves horizontally, the little horn moves vertically. Those are Rome and the little horn. And then finally, the sanctuary. Okay. Now, here's a very interesting quotation from none other than Sir Edward Gibbons, who wrote The History of the Decline of the Fall of the Western Roman Empire. He wrote, "The ambitious design of conquest, which might have been defeated by the seasonable conspiracy of mankind, was attempted and achieved, and the perpetual violation of justice was maintained by the political virtues of prudence and courage. The arms of the Republic, sometimes vanquished in battle, always victorious in war, advanced with rapid steps to the Euphrates, the Danube, the Rhine, and eventually the ocean." Now watch how he concludes this paragraph. "And the images of gold or silver or brass that might serve to represent the nations and their kings were successively broken by the iron monarchy of Rome." Now, Gibbons was no friend of religion, I'll tell you that. But here he understood the basic trajectory of this prophetic scheme from Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece to Rome. And Rome is so central in Bible prophecy, and it's so central in the Gospels because Rome is the power that ends up finally, officially, tragically, and unjustly killing the Messiah. Remember we just mentioned earlier when Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and I said, well, what is that? An abomination is something God hates, and desolation is something that destroys. Why is God so antagonistic in Scripture against Rome? Well, think it through. Rome was the power through which Satan worked to end the life of the Messiah. Right? It wasn't Babylon that killed Jesus. It wasn't Medo-Persia that killed Jesus. It wasn't Greece that ended the life of Jesus. It was Rome. It happened during the time of Rome. And not only that, Rome not only killed Jesus, of course he was raised again, he was watched by Roman soldiers, nailed to a Roman instrument of torture, laid in a Roman tomb, but then Roman soldiers actually laid waste a second time to God's chosen city and to his beautiful temple. So God, you could say, has something against Rome. Okay? Not the people of Rome, because God loves people. Of course, he loves everybody, for God so loved the world. But what Rome represents, and we'll see tomorrow, particularly when Rome, after the conversion of a man named Constantine the Great, Rome ceased to be merely a political empire, and in AD 312, after the conversion of Constantine, up until AD 476, the final dissolution of the Roman Empire, Rome took on this weirdly weirdly unusual status of being both Roman and Christian. And it was this massive amalgamation of something that God absolutely detests. And then after the dissolution of Rome in AD 476, that Roman Empire then gave way to what was referred to later as the Holy Roman Empire, which was the medieval church, which in a strange twist of fate, the medieval church becomes arguably the single greatest enemy of the gospel. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. This is really exciting. Okay, reason number 3, and I purposely decided I wasn't going to spend much time on this, but I do want to just remind us of the times in which we live. Jesus' signs of the times are fulfilled all around us. In the book of, in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus gives a series of signs, indicators that we're living in the last days. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was one of them. He said there would be religious deceivers and confusion. Certainly that has followed since the time of Jesus and continues unabated. Today, he said there would be wars and rumors of wars. Of course, we live in a time right now where the number of people that have been either killed or displaced by wars are, in fact, I'll give you a fascinating, terrifying little statistic. There were more people killed in the 20th century, in the wars in the 20th century, than all of the previous 20 centuries combined in war. So you add up all the total people that died in war from AD, from 0 up until the 20th century. You add up all those people that were killed in war. Then you add up the people that were killed in war only in the 20th century, and there were more people killed in the 20th century than in the previous 19 centuries combined. It's astonishing. There are right now, in this day and age, roughly 1% of the Earth's population right now has been displaced from their home because of military conflict. 75 million people right now do not live in their homes or in their homeland because of military conflict that's taking place right now. That's 1%. 1 in 100 people in the world right now are out of their homes and from their ancestral lands or their native lands because of war right now. That's the world we live in. We live in a war that is just absolutely ravaged, a world that is absolutely ravaged by war. Jesus spoke about famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. I could spend some time on that, but I'm not going to. Massive religious persecution, which continued, which was a primary feature of the medieval period, but we're seeing even a resurgence of that, and we'll talk about that tomorrow night. The love of many growing cold. We could spend time on that. The gospel going to all the world, which is really good news. It's the only sign that's good news. The abomination of desolation. Here's where things get interesting. And man, I'm sorely tempted to say too much here, but fortunately for me, we're right at the end of time. The abomination of desolation that stood in the holy place actually had not only an historical fulfillment in AD 70, but will have multiple fulfillments. And we'll probably have an opportunity to talk about at least one, if not two of those, where Rome takes the place of something that is uniquely and specially God's and that is holy. The fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies that we've looked at, and just general difficulty and turmoil. Again, we remind ourselves of the metaphors. Labor pains, approaching spring, childbirth, and labor pains again. In other words, yes, it's a dark time. Yes, it's a dismal time. But God extends his love, his forgiveness, his kindness, his goodness, and his mercy to every single human being. Do you believe that? So everybody's being given an opportunity right now. This is the darkness. This is the extreme darkness before the soon coming dawn. Revelation chapter 4, the prophecies of Revelation are fulfilling. The prophecies of Revelation are fulfilling. So let's go back to Jesus, who's living, turn of the first century. Daniel was passed to him. Revelation was contemporaneous with him, or at least pretty close to. John was, of course, one of his disciples. But the prophecies of Revelation, which were future to Jesus, now check this out. Many of those prophecies are past to us. So here we are down here, and there are still a fair few prophecies that are yet future in Revelation, but the majority of Revelation's prophecies are already past, and I'll show you some of those tomorrow. Okay? So we are living at the end of basically all of the timelines. The timelines that have been announced in Scripture, going all the way back to Genesis, through the major prophets, through Daniel, into the time of Jesus and Revelation forward, we know we're living down toward the end because there's just not that many things yet future that have to happen. And then finally, number 5, this is one we actually didn't do too bad tonight. This is one that I really want to just impress upon your heart a bit. I want to impress it upon my own heart. A dear friend of mine, somebody that I value very much and who was the caretaker at my local church, just recently died unexpectedly, died of a heart attack. He's a wonderful man. He was the caretaker of our church. He and his wife lived together on the property, beautiful property. He did a great job taking care of it. His name was Jerry. Just a beautiful, wonderful, hardworking human being. And one of the things I loved about Jerry was that he was a very hard worker. He was just a godly man. One of the things that I would speak to Jerry about is that he was very passionate about conspiracy theories. Maybe passionate's too strong of a word. He quite liked conspiracy theories. He was quite abreast, and he was roundly persuaded that Jesus was coming very, 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 very soon, which is okay. I don't mind somebody being persuaded about that. But here's the small, maybe problem is not the right word, but here's something I want to bring to your attention. Jerry passed away before Jesus returned. Okay? There are lots of people that are in a similar situation, and I don't think this was necessarily the case with Jerry. I use him just as a small illustration. Don't be too anxious or fraught with anxiety about what the future holds, because your last day could be today. Right? It could be today. It could be, your last day could be this week, or even, I would have never thought that I would be performing Jerry's funeral. And it was one of the most difficult things I had to do. I just loved him, and our church is really sad now that he's gone. But all of those things that Jerry, I don't want to say worried about, because I think he had a pretty good handle on it, those things never came to pass in his lifetime. So the point I want to make here is that in Scripture, there is this beautiful tension between God's urgency and God's patience. Because we have been living technically in the last days since the ascension of Jesus, there have been people absolutely convinced for the last thousands of years that Jesus was going to come in their lifetime. And I am fairly sure that there are people in this room right now who are absolutely convinced that Jesus will come in your lifetime. And let me say this, I hope you're right. I hope you're right, but you need to prepare yourself for this basic statistical reality. You're probably wrong. Right? Because there have been millions that have gone before you that were just sure, hundreds of millions, that Jesus would come in their lifetime, and they're all in the graves right now, awaiting the resurrection. Okay, so I don't say this in any way to cause you to think that we don't live in urgent times, that we don't live in prophetically significant times. We do. I'm simply wanting you to bear in mind that your biggest concern is not the second coming of Jesus. It's the fact that you're about ready to get in a car and drive it on a